Hi, my name is Karen Fabian and I'm the founder of Bare Bones Yoga, and I'm here today to do a quick tutorial on the external rotators of the hip. So if you're already confused about what that means, let's just go over some basic movements that the hip makes. So the hip can move in a bunch of different directions because the joint itself is a ball and socket. And you can see how the head of the femur sits into the cup of the pelvis, and that connection is the hip joint. So the acetabulum here forms the cup and the head of the femur forms the connection. And a similar joint in structure is of course the shoulder joint, and so here you have the head of the humerus and the glenoid fossa of the scapula. Okay, so here we are talking about the hip, and because of the ball and socket structure of the joint itself, it can move in a bunch of different directions. So we can flex the hip. In this case, we're moving the thigh closer to the body. We can extend the hip, taking the thigh bone back, so moving here in this sagittal, what we call the sagittal plane. We can turn the feet out, therefore turning the hip out. It doesn't work so well here, but you can kind of get a sense of it. Or turn in. And so here's where we get into external rotation and internal rotation. And these movements take place in the transverse plane, which divides the body into a top and a bottom. And the other action that the hip joint can make, again similar to the shoulder, is we can move the thigh bone away from the midline or towards the midline. And this is known as abduction or adduction. And typically people remember the adduction because we're adding on to the midline versus taking away. So adduction, moving inward, abduction, moving outward. So now that we know the different movements, let's take a look at external rotation. So muscles that would turn the hip open, if we think about the idea of a muscle itself, so a connection from one point to another on the body, the muscle itself is the structure. And we think about in terms of the action of a muscle when it contracts, if we look at it a more simpler example, let's take the bicep brachialis. When the origin of the bicep up here on the upper part of the arm and the insertion down at the elbow, when the muscle contracts, the insertion is going to move closer to the origin. So in this case, in the human, here, okay? So this idea of the insertion moving closer to the origin, if you kind of wrap your brain around that and now think about, well, if I were to turn my hip out, first of all, and I like to go through it in this way because it's really easy to get completely overwhelmed with all the details of anatomy. So it's helpful, I think, to just think of things logically. So if we were to turn the hip out like this, where would the muscles that create this kind of movement need to reside? Well, they most likely wouldn't be in the front of the hip. They'd probably be in the back because I'm moving in this direction. So back here is where these external rotators live. And there's a number of them. The biggest one and the most commonly referred to is the piriformis. And the piriformis muscle gets kind of a bad rap because the sciatic nerve runs through the piriformis. And so sometimes when people suffer from sciatica, it's because the piriformis muscle is inflamed and it's placing some pressure on the nerve. But putting that aside, it is a big muscle and it is responsible for, again, external rotation. And it starts on the back, the posterior part of the body, on the pelvis, and it inserts on the greater trochanter of the humerus. Of the femur. And so here, if you think about, and again, we're not talking minutia detail, we're talking generally. So if you think of a muscle sitting back in this area here, if its insertion moves closer to its origin, and I'll turn around so you can see, so this is the right side of the pelvis, if its insertion moves closer to its origin, the hip is going to move out because this part is moving closer to here. So you can kind of generally think of that as the action of the muscle as it's contracting, okay? There are other muscles that are external rotators, and they all kind of lie in the same region. So we're additionally talking about the obturator internus and externus, and the gemelli internus and externus, and also the quadratus femoris. Again, you know, when we're teaching yoga, we're not specifically referring to these kinds of muscles, but as we study anatomy, it's helpful to know what these muscles are, the names, be familiar with the names, and to know generally where they are in the body and what their action is. And again, if we think kind of logically, well, they reside back here, insertion moving closer to origin, action would be to externally rotate the hip, and then we just have to get a little bit more familiar with the muscles themselves. So let's take a look now at the opposite movement, because it's always nice to kind of think about muscles working in pairs, and that's a really functional way to learn about the muscles in the body and also create some sequences where you can get both actions in. So when we said a minute ago, this is external rotation of the hip, we then said, well, this is internal rotation of the hip. So the two muscles that are primarily responsible for that are the gluteus minimus and the tensor fascia lata, or TFL. So the gluteus minimus is the smallest of the gluteal muscles, maximus, medius, and minimus, and it resides here on the lateral aspect of the pelvis. And the tensor fascia lata is actually the beginning section of what we typically know as the IT band, or the iliotibial band. And this starts out up here as the TFL and then turns into this thick band of tissue, muscular tissue, tendon-like tissue on the lateral aspect of the leg. In fact, I remember a year ago or so, a little less than, I did a full cadaver dissection at an anatomy lab in Arizona, and I remember when we got to the IT band, it was so tough. You could literally stick your hand underneath it and pull out and it would not tear. Unlike other muscle that, although it was strong, was a lot more likely to tear even if you would just move your hand through it. So again, that's just to give you an idea of how tough some of these muscles can be, and especially something like the IT band, where when you see it in a donor, it's actually white. Or if there was someone that underwent trauma and you were working in some kind of clinical situation, you might have access to seeing it as well. And the whiteness is, of course, moving more towards the tendinous aspect versus the red or the vascular aspect of what we typically think of muscles looking like, that red coloring. And furthermore, kind of following this along, because the IT band inserts on the knee, oftentimes when it's tight, people report knee pain. And it's really superior to the knee and lateral to the midline that the problem resides in terms of tightness in the IT band. So, having said all that, I just digressed a little bit, but just interesting commentary, I hope. The internal rotators of the hip then, the glute medius, minimus, and tensor fascia lata. So now we're moving in versus moving out. And keep in mind, when we think about muscles working one to do something and one to do the opposite thing, that's what's known as the antagonist and the agonist. And so if I'm doing the action of opening the hip, the agonists in that situation are the muscles we talked about back here: piriformis, gemelli muscles, quadratus femoris, and obturator muscles. In that case, the internal rotators are the antagonists. They antagonize that movement. If I'm turning the hip in, the muscles creating that movement are the agonists. So in this case, glute minimus and TFL, and the antagonists are the piriformis. Okay, so of course, all of this is in my bare bones yoga guide. Whoops. to Anatomy, which is a 200-page manual where I not only break down every major pose in the practice by muscle and action, but I also give you pictures of the muscles, including, of course, these muscles we're talking about here. So now that we've looked at things from kind of an anatomy perspective, let's look at it in terms of poses, just to kind of wrap up this brief tutorial. So external rotation is something we do a lot in yoga. So think about some of the postures where you'd see external rotation. So here, this hip is an external rotation, this hip is an internal rotation. When I do it on the other side, of course, the converse applies. So this is your warrior two. If I want to bilaterally internally rotate the hip, I could do something like eagle pose, where both hips are turning in. If I wanted to do bilateral external rotation, I could do something like a goddess pose, like a squat scenario. That would put me into bilateral external rotation. So you can start to see how applying this understanding of muscle groups can be helpful when we look at individual postures. We want to better understand what's happening in the pose. When you look at sequencing, I know that in years past there was some conversation about it's not good to do too much of this and then too much of that. I kind of feel like, you know, it really depends on the teacher and the student and what you're trying to emphasize. You could very easily create a sequence that focused on internal and external rotation of the hip, and through integrating some of the poses I just went through and some additional ones that you like, you could really come up with a 60-minute sequence where that was the anatomical focus. And keep in mind, as we're talking about agonists and antagonists, it's helpful to move in both directions, because you're then in one scenario contracting muscles. So here I'm contracting the piriformis and its friends. And at the same time, because I'm contracting the external rotators, what am I doing to the internal rotators? I'm lengthening them. When I move in the other direction, I'm contracting the internal rotators, but I'm lengthening the external rotators. So let's kind of take that a step further. What if somebody comes to you and they go, oh, whenever I turn my hip out, I feel a lot of tightness, or I have sciatica. You know, again, this is a little bit of a simplistic explanation, but if we want to think about how to help that student, we have to think, okay, so if this is where the sensation occurs that feels tight, why don't I try offering some postures that lengthen the muscles that externally rotate the hip? So I'm going to offer bilateral hip rotation poses. So again, it could be something like eagle, could be something like cow face pose, lying on the back. You could do the same thing and just change your relationship to gravity. So this is where you can begin to see how important it is to understand the basics, to understand maybe a little bit more than the basics, because when we're getting into different muscles and their names and their actions, it's a little bit more detail. But then we need to be able to kind of work up from there and apply that to real people, right? And practicing and sequencing and modifying and helping people create little mini sequences that will help them start to explore the body parts that are giving them some feedback, and see through self-exploration if some of these movements start to alleviate their symptoms. If not, we got to try something else. You know, again, because nothing works in isolation, sometimes we might think, oh, if I'm getting some pain and tightness this way, I got to just move that way. Might not be the answer, but it's certainly a good place to start. So again, if you like this kind of thing, my anatomy guide again gives you poses, breaks down each pose, gives you cues to give for each posture, gives you pictures of the muscles, detailed explanation of all the key muscles in the body, along with a lot of the anatomical terms, such that we talked about at the beginning of the video here in terms of different movements and different anatomical terms. And then at the end, I go into things like modifications in practice and different sequencing ideas. So it's really a kind of a one-stop shop in terms of a resource for yoga teachers. And you can get this on my website for $65. So the website is barebonesyoga.com. If you have any questions, feel free to send me an email. I love getting emails about yoga and anatomy. And thank you so much for watching and have a wonderful day. Namaste.